Okay, so we're going to talk about social problems. This entire course revolves around the question of social problems and what makes something a social problem. What are the social problems that we can identify? So a first step in really understanding and being able to analyze social problems is to understand what it is that we want to call a social problem. So let's think then about how it is that sociologists want to define what constitutes social problems. What makes something a social problem? And there's two real parts to this phrase that we really want to break down. The first is to think about this as a social phenomenon, that it's rooted not in particular issues related to individuals, personalities, psychologies, individual kinds of actions, but that a social problem can be understood by looking only at society, that the root of the problem itself is in the way that society is organized. We'll come back to that in a moment. Now, the second part is to think of this as a problem. What does it mean for something to be a problem? And this is really important and often tricky to understand, so I want to walk through this a little bit. There's really two kind of components to thinking about something as a problem. When sociologists talk about social problems, we can talk about and think about both the objective and subjective components. So when we're thinking about those objective components, it's that real people's lives are, in a very real and material way, negatively affected. So to speak of the objective component of a social problem is to look at it as something that produces a negative outcome. It has real negative consequences, and not just for one or two people, but for lots of people in a particular society. It imposes some harm on people. The second part of that, and that may be that objective component may have been already what you were thinking about, but the second component is really critical to understanding and analyzing social problems. It's the subjective component of a social problem, and this is rooted in perception. That is, for something to be a social problem, people have to perceive it and define it as a problem. It's not simply enough that people are negatively impacted, but for it to raise or rise to the level of a social problem, people have to actually define it as a problem as such. Now, it could be, in one sense, you may really want to focus on the objective component and say, no, what really matters here is the negative outcome that is induced by this particular form of social organization. And I think that's totally reasonable. But when we think about how it is that people politically mobilize and organize around that negative outcome, now we're thinking about them as perceiving and defining it as a problem. So one of the things that this subjective component does that I want you to really be able to see and think about is that it infuses the notion of power into our understanding of social problems. That is, it raises the question of who gets to define something as a problem. Let's take the example of unemployment. Unemployment is certainly a social problem. If it were just one or two people who couldn't find work for individual reasons, this might not be something we want to call a social problem, but we have large numbers of people who are unable to find employment. And this is not, we think about it in the current moment, in the pandemic, for example, as a function or as happening on a broad scale. But actually inside of our society, there are always 3, 4, sometimes 5% of the population that is unemployed trying to find a job. Now, again, this is a social problem, and I want you to see it as a social problem in part because it is about the way that we organize our society. It is rooted in basically the capitalist institutions that govern our economy. These institutions need to have large numbers of people unemployed to constantly churn through and actually keep wages low. Having people actively looking for jobs means that there are other people who could be threatened with replacement. being replaced by those people if those other people are willing to accept that same job at a lower wage. So this pushes wage rates down. So it is a social problem. It's built into the structure of our society. Now, one of the things that is really important to see is that we often don't think about it in normal times as a social problem. And there's a real question of why. Why don't we think about those moments in a quote-unquote good economy when 3% of the people are looking for work? Why don't we define that as a social problem? It's because there are people in positions of power who choose not to define it as a problem. We have to have legislators, politicians come out and openly articulate it as a social problem. And they don't do this in part because there are corporate backers who are pushing them to keep them from talking about and seeing and viewing unemployment as a social problem. Again, why do they not want us to think about this as a social problem? Well, because it works in their interest to have people unemployed. It pushes wages down, opening up opportunities for them to gain profits for themselves. So power is at the heart of defining social problem. Those in power must come to accept some given issue as a social problem. They must see it, perceive it, and define it as a problem that needs to be addressed. And one of the things that I want you to see here is that social movements become really critical in pushing those who are in power to see something as a problem, even when they may not naturally want to see it or may not be in their interests to see it as a social problem. And so with this in mind, I want to encourage you to connect what we've talked about here, connect this issue of defining a social problem to the issue and connect the issue of power in that problem of defining social problems to what in your text is talked about as the natural history of social problems. So read back through the text, and I want you to infuse in there this idea of power, of mobilizing and pushing people to define, particular people, those in positions of power, to define something as a social problem. All right, thanks so much.